This is not merely a doctrinal matter, for the principle is the same in the church life today. While we are enjoying Christ as the seed within and as the land without, a dark night may fall upon us, and some trials and testings may come. What is the purpose of this? For the purpose that in the midst of the dark night, the lack of function of the called ones and the affliction, God might come in as a smoking furnace to refine us, and as a flaming torch to enlighten us, that we may fulfill His purpose by the seed and by the land. As a sign for the fulfillment of God's covenant. In making the covenant with Abraham, God sovereignly made an environment of darkness in which He told Abraham and his descendants would suffer affliction for 400 years. This prophecy, which was fulfilled accordingly, was a sign for the fulfillment of God's covenant made here. The affliction of the promised seed was a sign that God would fulfill His covenant. By suffering the affliction as God prophesied, God's people should be assured that God will fulfill His covenant. It's the same with us today. The suffering of the church in dark times is a strong sign that God will fulfill His covenant for the church life with Christ as the seed and the land. In verse 18, the Lord made the covenant with Abraham and said, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Abraham's seed was given a spacious land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates. The nation of Israel today has only a narrow strip of land, but the promised land is more spacious than this. In typology, this means that after all of the experiences of affliction, the church life will be expanded and become spacious. Then we shall have a richer seed and a wider, broader church life. The seed within us will be richer, and the land without us will be broader. It is here that we fulfill God's eternal purpose. I believe that now, by the Lord's mercy, Genesis 15, a chapter which has been so difficult to understand, has been made clear to us. In this chapter, we have the seed and the land. Here we have Christ as the crucified one and as the resurrected and living one. Here we also have our identification with Him. In this chapter, there are the 400 years of affliction and God's coming in as a furnace and a torch. It's here that God enacted His covenant that we might fulfill His eternal purpose. How did God enact His covenant? In the way of Christ being crucified as the peace offering, sin offering, and burnt offering, and being resurrected as the living one. In the way of our offering Christ and being fully identified with Him in His crucifixion and resurrection. And in the way of our realizing that we shall have the dark night, the affliction, and God's coming in as the furnace and the torch to refine and enlighten us. It is here in Genesis 15 that we are in the covenant made through Christ that enables us to fulfill God's eternal purpose. It is here that in the church life we enjoy Christ as the seed and as the good land. It is here that we enjoy Him as the all-sufficient grace for the fulfillment of God's purpose. Life Study of Genesis, Message 46, Knowing Grace for the Fulfillment of God's Purpose. The Allegory of the Two Women. Genesis is a book of the riches of God's divine revelation. The more I stay with this book, the more I enjoy its sweet riches. When we read the book of Genesis, we need the divine enlightenment. For by our human mentality, we cannot get anything out of this book except historical records and some interesting stories. When I was young, I was happy to hear the stories in this book. But if we only understand Genesis as a storybook, we shall miss a great deal. The allegory of the two women, Sarah and Hagar, the wife and the concubine of Abraham, God's called one, are an allegory of two covenants. If the Apostle Paul had not written the book of Galatians, in which he tells us that these two women are an allegory of two covenants, none of us would ever have dreamed of such a thing. Although some Christians criticize the allegorization of the Bible, Paul took the lead to allegorize the Old Testament. If we are going to appreciate the treasures in the book of Genesis, we must realize that Genesis is a book of allegories. Abraham's biography is an allegory. His wife and his concubine especially are a very meaningful allegory. In this message, we shall do our best to probe into the meaning of this allegory. Before we come to this allegory, however, we need to see something about the book of Genesis. Why is Genesis so sweet and precious? Because it is a book containing many seeds of the divine revelation that were sown by God Himself. This book contains all of the main aspects of God's divine revelation. In the very first chapter, we see that God has an intention to express himself through man, and that for this purpose, he created man in his own image. Man was made according to God's image with the intention that he might become God's exact expression, and that through this expression, God might have a dominion, a kingdom, in which he could exercise his authority. This is God's ultimate intention, His eternal purpose. If you read the Bible with this heavenly light, you will see that the whole Bible covers the divine intention. In order for God to fulfill His intention of having Himself expressed and of obtaining a dominion on earth, He needs to have the seed and the land, both of which are related to Christ. This Christ must be brought into God's people. God wanted to do this with Adam, but Adam failed. Eventually, God had a new start with a new race, the race of the called ones, the first one of which was Abraham. If you read Abraham's biography, you see that again and again God came to him with a promise concerning two things, the seed and the land. Abraham was not young when he was first called by God. He was 75 years of age when he answered God's calling in a full way.